make of them in general?
I think the top line point here is that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are really in very choppy waters. While we find that voters are quite open to some of their specific policies, like helping people get off benefits and back into work, large majorities are clearly dubious about the Conservative Party's handling of the economy and do not really see Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party as their preferred manager of the economy. And that's going to mean some pretty difficult obstacles for Sunak and his party going into that next election.
Do you think the idea from Sunak and the Chancellor is that actually they've got 2 years in which to calm the markets and put things right before they get to the general election in 2024?
Well, I imagine that that's the plan in number 10 and number 11. But of course, what we've seen this week are some truly scary forecasts. The next 2 years are going to be phenomenally difficult for the country. We're going to see a collapse of living standards of the like we've not really seen since the 1950s, some people suggest. We're going to see rapidly increasing costs to energy bills, mortgage rates, and also council tax. When we ask people, who do you trust to run the economy during these times? Only 30% of the country chose Sunak and the Conservatives. And that's a real problem for the party. We also find, by the way, that only a minority of 2019 Conservative Party voters back their own party on the economy. So if I were Rishi Sunak's advisor looking at these numbers, I would be panicking, to be honest.
How much, Matt, do you think the media has some say in this? Because, I mean, if you think 21% blame Liz Truss, who didn't actually get much of a chance to even implement her budget, and the cost of that was only $4 billion, yet the cost of lockdown was $500 billion. So is this about people responding to what they've just seen in the press most recently? Well,
I think, Martin, the issue with COVID and the energy crisis is nobody's really being straight with the British people about the amount of money these things actually cost. We've got this ludicrous debate in this country that seems to be blaming the mini budget for everything. Step back and look at the broader picture. As you say, we've spent hundreds of billions on COVID. We've spent hundreds of billions on the energy crisis. Before we even got to those moments, we've spent billions on all kinds of things. Our debt to GDP is now close to 100%. To put that in context for viewers, we are spending this year £120 billion just servicing the interest on our debt. 120 billion. We spend 190 billion on the NHS. So that gives you some sense of how much we're spending on the interest on our national credit card. And over the next 5 years, Martin, that's going to be on average about 98 billion. So when people about 10 years ago were saying, you don't need to worry about debt, you don't need to worry about debt, interest rates are low, let's just keep spending. Actually, now that the markets have started to change, now that interest rates have started to go up, all we can see clearly is that debt is having an enormous impact on our national finances and our ability to give people a good, dignified quality of living. So I hope we can have some leaders that step forward and come up with a long-term plan for getting that big pile of debt down and getting the economy growing again. Because if we don't, we are not just looking at a lost decade, Martin, we're potentially looking at a much worse period than that.
So, Matt, I know the People poll does a lot of stuff outside of this exclusive GBNews poll. You do a lot of polling into people's propensity to change how they vote. There hasn't been much of a bounce for the Conservatives since the budget. Are people thinking about voting in a new way? Are you seeing any evidence of that, other parties?
Well, what should worry Mr Sunak is this week we have the Conservatives back on 21%. Labour are up 5 points to almost 50%. So if there were an election tomorrow, you're looking at a Labour majority of around 250, and you're looking at around 100 Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. So you're still looking at wipeout territory for the Conservatives. But it's true, as you suggest, what we've also seen is a slight increase in support for what you might call challenger parties. The Greens have been up in a few polls recently. Reform to the right of the Conservatives have been up recently in a few polls. In fact, actually last week we had Reform on 8%. That was the highest level of support in polling history. Another polling house had them on 9% this week, which again is another high. So, here's a nightmare scenario for the Conservatives. They don't make any headway in the national polls. They start to get clipped on the right of their flank by a new party. Even if that party gets 5%, that's more than enough to cause them a big problem. And underneath all of that, just lastly, when we poll Leavers and Brexit voters, many people who will be watching this show, we find that 1/4 of those Brexit voters are now expressing doubts about Brexit, not necessarily because they want to overturn it and go back in the EU, but I think because they're looking at this vision of Brexit that has been given to them by the political class. And, it's high migration, it's London-centric, it's basically doubling down on the consensus of the last 20, 30 years. And they're asking themselves, well, what on earth happened to my vision of Brexit, which was about low migration, which was about tilting away from London and the southeast, was about redistributing power in the country, not just economic resources. And I think that's why we're seeing these really high levels of apathy among Leavers who are just giving up on the entire system. And that, again, Martin, is a dangerous place for any democracy to be.
Matt, I think that overall you are suggesting, as I think we feel, that what this poll actually does suggest is that most people in Britain are actually fed up with all of our politicians, never mind which party they're in, which is why there's talk perhaps of new parties being formed.